July 1944. The Mariana Islands. The air inside the canvas medical tent is heavy with the scent of ether and sterilized cotton. A Japanese infantryman, pulled semi-conscious from the shattered limestone ridges of Saipan, forces his eyes open against the glare of a surgical lamp. For years, the imperial propaganda machine has drilled a singular, terrifying absolute into his mind. Capture by the Americans guarantees a slow, agonizing death. He expects the bite of a bayonet, the crack of a rifle butt, or the cruel hands of a torturer. Instead, his vision blurs, then suddenly sharpens on a glass bottle of blood plasma suspended above him. A cool, damp cloth presses against his feverish forehead. He turns his head and sees her, an American military nurse in a crisp, olive-drab fatigue uniform. She does not hold a weapon. She is calmly adjusting the flow of an intravenous drip, feeding life back into his shattered veins. The soldier braces for the cruelty he was promised, but the only touch he feels is the careful, deliberate application of a clean bandage. It is a quiet, sterile collision of two entirely different worlds, and the beginning of a profound psychological unraveling. To understand the sheer gravity of a single tear shed in an American medical tent, one must first understand the iron fortress of the Imperial Japanese mind. This was not a mindset born in the heat of combat. It was a psychological architecture, constructed over decades, meticulously engineered by the state to eliminate the very concept of individual survival. From the earliest days of elementary school, Japanese citizens of the Showa era were molded by a curriculum of absolute subservience to the emperor, who was revered not merely as a head of state, but as a living deity. The individual was nothing. The empire was everything. In previous conflicts, such as the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, the Japanese military had actually prided itself on its humane treatment of prisoners, strictly adhering to international law to prove its standing as a modern, civilized power. By the 1930s, however, as the military seized absolute control of the government and plunged the nation into total war across Asia, this doctrine of honor shifted into something entirely uncompromising. The traditional, romanticized ideals of the samurai bushido were corrupted and weaponized by the high command. The goal was to forge an army completely devoid of hesitation and utterly immune to the basic human instinct of self-preservation. The definitive turning point in this psychological conditioning occurred on January 8, 1941. War Minister Hideki Tojo issued the Senjinkun, the Field Service Code, distributed as a pocket-sized manual to every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army. It was not merely a set of tactical guidelines. It was a dogmatic text of war. Its most famous and fatal directive was absolute. Do not live to suffer the shame of an intact capture. Do not leave behind a name soiled by misdeeds. Through these two sentences, the Japanese military apparatus effectively erased the internationally recognized right to surrender. To lay down one's arms was no longer a tactical decision made when a battle was lost. It was an act of supreme treason. The consequences of capture extended far beyond the battlefield, reaching violently back to the home islands. A soldier taken alive was officially declared dead by the state. His name was permanently struck from his family registry, the Kaseki. His wife would be legally considered a widow, his children branded as outcasts, and his ancestors eternally shamed. For the Japanese infantrymen, surrender did not mean surviving the war. It meant spiritual and social annihilation. To enforce this merciless doctrine and prevent any lingering temptation to yield, the government built a secondary wall of profound terror. Through a relentless campaign of domestic propaganda, the Allied forces were entirely dehumanized. The state utilized the phrase Kichiku Bei, translating roughly to demonic Americans in British. Official military briefings, newspapers, and cinema newsreels painted Allied troops as sadistic monsters, ravenous beasts devoid of any human empathy. Japanese soldiers were repeatedly instructed that American forces possessed a bloodthirsty mandate to torture captives, castrate the wounded, and crush the bones of the defeated beneath the tracks of their Sherman tanks. Rumors were carefully seeded by political officers to target the specific vulnerabilities of wounded men. American doctors, they claimed, would amputate limbs without anesthetic for mere practice, or drain the blood of Japanese prisoners to transfuse into their own wounded. The American Medical Corps was depicted not as an institution of healing, but as an industrialized network of butchers. This barrage of psychological conditioning left the average Japanese soldier in a state of terminal resolve. He marched into the dense jungles and volcanic islands of the Pacific, not just prepared to die, but actively seeking a glorious death as his only avenue of escape. He believed with absolute certainty that the men landing on the beaches in front of him were merciless predators. This impenetrable armor of fear and fanaticism would soon be put to the ultimate test against the grinding, mechanized onslaught of the American war machine across the coral atolls of the Pacific. By late 1943, this psychological armor was put to the ultimate test as the United States launched its relentless island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific. The doctrine of the Senjinkun collided violently with the overwhelming industrial and mechanized might of the Allied forces. The resulting combat on islands like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Saipan was not merely a clash of armies. It was a meat grinder of unprecedented savagery. The environment itself was incredibly hostile. The battlefields were composed of razor-sharp coral ridges, suffocating volcanic ash, and dense, unforgiving jungles. To counter the American naval and aerial supremacy, the Japanese military burrowed deep into the earth. They constructed elaborate, heavily fortified cave networks, transforming entire islands into interconnected subterranean fortresses. Here, in the dark, the Japanese infantrymen waited, fully prepared to die. The statistics of these battles are a grim testament to the success of their psychological conditioning. On Tarawa in November 1943, of the nearly 5,000 Japanese defenders garrisoned on the tiny atoll, only 17 combat soldiers and 129 laborers survived. Entire units fought until their ammunition was completely exhausted. When the bullets ran out, there was no white flag. Instead, officers drew their shin-gunto swords, men fixed bayonets or sharpened bamboo spears, and they launched massive, suicidal banzai charges directly into American machine gun fire. When charges failed, or when they were trapped inside their bunkers by American flamethrowers and satchel charges, the Japanese soldiers adhered strictly to their lethal orders. Officers routinely beheaded their own severely wounded men to spare them capture. Enlisted men clutched Type 97 fragmentation grenades to their stomachs, pulled the pins, and waited for the detonation. On Saipan in June 1944, this fanaticism reached its absolute darkest peak. Not only did the military garrison fight to its near-total annihilation, but thousands of Japanese civilians, utterly terrified of the American monsters they had been promised, would torture them, hurled themselves and their children from the towering limestone cliffs of Marpi Point into the sea. With such an absolute commitment to death, a critical question arises: how did the Americans capture any prisoners at all? The answer lies not in a failure of Japanese resolve, but in the inescapable limits of human biology. The Japanese men who ended up on American stretchers almost never walked there willingly. They were the anomalies. An infantryman could possess the strongest will to die for the emperor, but his nervous system could not withstand the barometric overpressure of a 16-inch, high-explosive shell from an American battleship. Most captured Japanese soldiers were simply rendered physically incapable of executing their final orders. Hundreds were knocked instantly unconscious by the concussive shockwaves of artillery and naval bombardments, buried alive in the rubble of their own pulverized bunkers. Others were entirely paralyzed by the ravages of tropical diseases. Severe outbreaks of malaria, dengue fever, and amoebic dysentery swept through the blockaded Japanese garrisons. By the time American forces overran their positions, many of these men were delirious, suffering from extreme fever and dehydration, their bodies far too weak to lift a weapon or pull the pin on a grenade. Still others bled out from shrapnel wounds, slipping into shock and comas before they could perform the required act of self-destruction. When United States Marines and Army infantrymen advanced through the smoking ruins, they found these broken men, unconscious, starving, and bleeding into the coral. At this exact moment, the inflexible Japanese doctrine of death met the strict American doctrine of life. United States combat medics, governed by the Geneva Conventions and their own deeply ingrained medical ethics, moved in to stabilize the wounded. Regardless of the uniform they wore, the unconscious Japanese soldier was systematically disarmed, loaded onto a Jeep ambulance, and pushed into the rapid American medical evacuation chain. He was taken from the dirt and blood of the front line and transported toward the sterile, highly organized rear echelon medical facilities. For the incapacitated soldier, the battle was over, but as the shock wore off and his eyes began to flutter open, he found himself hurtling directly toward the very nightmare he had been conditioned to fear most. The journey from the pulverized coral of the front line to the sterile sanctuary of an American medical facility was a masterclass in logistical supremacy. While the Japanese military struggled to supply its isolated island garrisons with basic rations, clean water, and ammunition, the United States deployed an overwhelming, highly organized network of mobile healthcare. Behind the advancing infantry, combat engineers rapidly leveled terrain to erect sprawling canvas cities. These field hospitals were fully functioning surgical units, powered by roaring diesel generators and stocked with seemingly limitless supplies of sterile gauze, morphine, sulfa powder, and whole blood. Further offshore, riding the gentle Pacific swells, sat the ultimate symbols of American medical might, massive, gleaming white hospital ships like the USS Relief and the USS Solace. Emblazoned with giant red crosses, these floating sanctuaries featured climate-controlled wards, advanced X-ray machines, and fully staffed surgical suites. Into this industrial marvel of healing, the broken bodies of Japanese soldiers were carried. The physical transition was violently jarring. A man pulled from a lightless, disease-ridden limestone cave, accustomed only to the stench of cordite and decaying flesh, suddenly found himself resting on clean white sheets, bathed in the harsh, artificial glow of electric surgical lamps. Here, the strict dictates of allied medical doctrine took absolute precedence over the bitter animosities of the battlefield. Guided by the Geneva Conventions and the intrinsic ethics of the medical profession, American military doctors and corpsmen viewed a shattered femur or a sucking chest wound as a purely physiological crisis. The uniform the patient wore was secondary. A wounded enemy combatant, once disarmed and secured by military police, was triaged alongside American Marines and Army infantrymen. If a Japanese soldier's injuries were deemed more immediately life-threatening than those of a wounded American, the Japanese soldier was wheeled into the operating theater first. Yet, for the Japanese prisoner of war, this pristine medical environment was not perceived as a sanctuary. It was viewed as the inner sanctum of the demon. When the field anesthesia wore off or the malarial fever finally broke, the initial awakening was almost universally characterized by absolute visceral terror. The imperial propaganda machine had done its work flawlessly. The soldier, recognizing the Caucasian faces and olive-drab uniforms of his captors, did not feel gratitude for his unexpected survival. He felt the cold, crushing weight of infinite dishonor, coupled with the immediate expectation of agonizing torture. The resulting scenes in these bustling, Field hospitals were chaotic and deeply tragic. Japanese POWs, many missing limbs or suffering from severe internal trauma, would violently resist any form of treatment. Driven by a desperate, ingrained need to fulfill the mandates of the Senjinkun and reclaim a final shred of their lost honor, they weaponized their own broken bodies. Men violently ripped intravenous lines from their arms, watching their own blood pool on the canvas cots in a desperate bid to bleed out. They tore away sterile surgical dressings with their teeth, attempting to reopen their stitched wounds and invite fatal infection. Others firmly clamped their jaws shut, refusing to swallow life-saving medication, or spat precious drinking water back into the faces of the American corpsmen, attempting to hydrate them. In many cases, military police and medical orderlies were forced to physically restrain the prisoners, strapping them to their cots, to prevent them from committing suicide within the wards. When physical resistance failed due to sheer physiological exhaustion, a profound psychological resistance took over. Japanese-American interpreters working within these medical tents recorded countless, harrowing instances of Japanese prisoners begging their captors to execute them. They would gesture wildly to the military police guard's sidearms, pleading for a single bullet to end their profound national and familial shame. Some would deliberately hurl insults, attempting to provoke an American sentry or a surgeon into a fatal act of anger. They fundamentally could not process the concept of an enemy expending highly valuable resources, human blood plasma, rare penicillin, and exhausted surgical time to save their lives. In their heavily conditioned minds, there was only one logical explanation. The Americans were intentionally keeping them alive to subject them to prolonged, unimaginable sadism. They braced themselves, muscles tensed, waiting for the monsters to finally reveal their true nature. But the torture never came, and instead, these terrified soldiers were about to face an entirely different kind of shock, one that would completely shatter their understanding of the world. The rusted, ironclad walls of imperial indoctrination did not fall to bullets or bayonets. They crumbled at the soft, deliberate rustle of a cotton uniform. As the terrified Japanese prisoner lay strapped to his canvas cot, exhausted from his own violent resistance and bracing for the executioner's blade, the figure that finally approached him defied every parameter of his reality. It was a woman, specifically an officer of the United States Army Nurse Corps or the Navy Nurse Corps. To comprehend the sheer, paralyzing shock of this moment, one must understand the strict gender hierarchy of Imperial Japan. In the heavily militarized, hyper-patriarchal society of the Showa era, women were relegated to rigidly subservient roles. Within the Japanese military apparatus, female nurses existed, but they held no commissioned rank, commanded zero authority over male soldiers, and were frequently subjected to harsh discipline. The idea of a woman holding high status, let alone exerting authority in a combat zone over fighting men, was culturally alien. Furthermore, wartime propaganda had painted American women as morally bankrupt and degenerate, yet here she was, an American woman, thousands of miles from her home, walking freely among the bloodied casualties of a Pacific battlefield. She wore the silver bars or gold oak leaves of a commissioned officer. Male corpsmen deferred to her instructions. Heavily armed military police stepped aside to let her pass. She carried no weapon, only a medical chart, a thermometer, or a syringe of precious penicillin. When she reached the bed of the captive Japanese infantryman, she did not look upon him with the righteous vengeance his government had promised. She looked at him with the focused clinical empathy of a medical professional. She washed the dark volcanic ash from his face. She carefully removed the foul necrotic dressings from his shattered limbs. She checked his vitals, her hands steady, her demeanor entirely devoid of malice. For the Japanese soldier, this was a physiological and psychological impossibility. It created a profound, agonizing cognitive dissonance. If the Americans were the bloodthirsty, sadistic beasts the Emperor's generals had claimed, why were there women here? Why would these alleged monsters expose their own women to the horrors of the front line, purely to heal the enemy that had just tried to annihilate them? The propaganda narrative could not sustain this physical reality. It fractured, and as that lie shattered, the entire foundation of the soldiers' fanatical loyalty collapsed with it. This psychological rupture triggered one of the most remarkable intelligence shifts of the Pacific War. Allied interrogators, particularly the Japanese-American linguists of the Military Intelligence Service, EMIS, soon discovered a stunning phenomenon. Once a Japanese POW realized he was not going to be tortured, and specifically after he was treated with unexpected dignity by female medical staff, his resistance evaporated. The transformation was absolute and immediate. In the Japanese cultural framework, the concept of a deep, lifelong burden of debt and obligation was paramount. The soldier had been officially declared dead by his homeland the moment he was captured. His government had lied to him, ordering him to throw his life away for a fabricated nightmare. By saving his life, feeding him, and treating him with grace, the Americans had inadvertently become his new masters of honor. He owed them his very existence. Consequently, these legally dead men began to speak. They did not just offer their names and ranks. They emptied their minds. They provided intricate details of bunker complexes on Iwo Jima, the defensive layouts of Okinawa, and the exact supply routes used by the Imperial Japanese Navy. They corrected Allied topographical maps. They willingly translated captured documents, often sitting side by side with the very American intelligence officers they had been ordered to kill days prior. This was not viewed by the POWs as an act of treason. In their minds, the men who swore absolute allegiance to the Emperor had already died on the coral ridges. The men sitting in the interrogation tents were entirely new entities, reborn through the shocking compassion of their captors. But before this rebirth could fully take hold, every prisoner had to face a singular, defining physical trial, a moment suspended between life and death, where the reality of American mercy was cut directly into their flesh. The true crucible of this psychological transformation did not occur in the interrogation tent, but under the blinding heat-radiating bulbs of the surgical theater. The field hospital operating room was a chaotic symphony of life-saving machinery. Diesel generators roared outside the canvas walls, powering the suction machines and sterilizing autoclaves. Inside, the air was thick with the sharp medicinal sting of ether, iodine, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. For the severely wounded Japanese prisoner, wheeled into this overwhelming environment, the operating table was the terrifying threshold he had been warned about. This, he believed, was the torture chamber. This was the laboratory of the demonic. Americans where the vivisections would begin. He lay strapped to the surgical table, his body battered by high-explosive shrapnel or ravaged by deep tissue infections. His mind raced with the final horrifying promises of his political officers. He braced his muscles for the agony of an unanesthetized amputation. He waited for the mocking laughter of his captors. He expected the absolute worst of human nature. Instead, a needle pierced his vein. The touch was quick, practiced, and distinctly careful. It was an American nurse, moving with calm, clinical precision, establishing an intravenous line. Above him hung a glass bottle of reconstituted blood plasma, or perhaps whole blood drawn directly from the veins of United States Marines and sailors. The Japanese soldier, fading in and out of consciousness, watched as the fluid traveled down the amber, rubber tubing and entered his own arm. This visual alone was a catastrophic blow to his heavily conditioned worldview. Blood was the ultimate commodity of war. In the Imperial Japanese Army, medical supplies were catastrophically scarce. By 1944, Japanese field surgeons were routinely operating without anesthesia, relying on crude wooden saws and unsterilized bandages, commanding their patience to bite down on sticks and bear the pain for the emperor. Yet here, in the heart of the enemy camp, the Americans were willingly pumping their own life force into the veins of a sworn enemy. They were utilizing precious, highly limited resources that could have been saved for their own wounded, to pull a discarded Japanese infantryman back from the brink of death. Then came the surgical intervention. The American surgeon, his face obscured by a white mask, stepped to the table. He did not wield a blade with malice. He moved with the exhausted, rapid efficiency of a man desperately trying to outpace death. The anesthesiologist adjusted a valve, and the sweet, suffocating scent of ether pulled the prisoner under. When the soldier awoke hours later, the phantom pain of torture was absent. Instead, he felt the tight, secure binding of sterile gauze. His shattered bones had been painstakingly set and pinned. Shrapnel had been meticulously extracted from his abdominal cavity. Deep, necrotic wounds had been heavily dusted with sulfanilamide powder, preventing the fatal onset of gangrene. Most astonishingly, a nurse routinely approached his cot to administer injections of a miraculous amber-colored liquid, penicillin. This revolutionary antibiotic was virtually unknown to the Japanese frontline soldier. It was an expensive, closely guarded medical marvel that was actively eradicating the massive infections that would have certainly killed him in his own army's care. Every dose of penicillin, every unit of plasma, and every hour of surgical time was a tangible, undeniable investment in his survival. The sensory reality of the post-operative ward crushed the final remnants of his indoctrination. He lay in a clean bed. He was not left to lie in his own filth. He was gently turned and bathed by medical orderlies to prevent bed sores. When he moaned in pain, an American nurse did not strike him. She administered a measured dose of morphine, easing his suffering with a gentle, reassuring hand on his shoulder. The violence he had inflicted upon the Americans days earlier was entirely separated from the care he was receiving now. The battlefield had been left at the door of the hospital tent, in the quiet hours of the night, illuminated only by the soft glow of the ward lanterns. The sheer magnitude of this medical intervention settled over the Japanese prisoners. They were alive not by accident, but by the deliberate, concerted effort of the very people they had been ordered to despise. They were forced to reconcile the monstrous caricatures of their propaganda with the tired, compassionate faces of the American medical staff. This irreconcilable truth began to tear at their minds, building toward an emotional dam break that no amount of military discipline could contain. Asterisk. The dam broke not during the chaos of the day, but in the quiet, agonizing hours of the night. The adrenaline of combat had long since evaporated, leaving behind a profound, terrifying stillness. For the first time in months, perhaps years, the Japanese soldier was not being screamed at by a superior officer. He was not starving in a damp, mosquito-infested cave, clutching a live grenade. He was simply lying in a bed, staring up at the canvas ceiling of the United States Army Field Hospital. In this sterile silence, the psychological conditioning of a lifetime began to rapidly and violently unravel. The catalyst was almost always a simple, devastating act of human kindness. It was an American nurse handing a prisoner a cool tin cup of water, her fingers lightly brushing his. It was the offering of a lit cigarette, placed gently between the lips of a man whose arms were heavily bandaged. Or it was the taste of canned American peaches, a miraculous, impossible luxury for a soldier who had spent the last 3 weeks eating compressed grass, tree bark, and raw snails. When confronted with this gentle reality, the iron stoicism demanded by the samurai code shattered. Across the Pacific theater, from the bloody medical tents of Peleliu to the pristine hospital ships anchored off Okinawa, military doctors and translators recorded the exact same phenomenon. The Japanese prisoners began to weep. These were men who had unflinchingly charged into heavy .30 caliber machine gun fire. They had watched their closest comrades be vaporized by naval artillery without blinking. They had been fully prepared to detonate high explosives against their own chests to avoid capture. Yet, they were completely undone by a clean bandage and a soft voice. In the Imperial Japanese Army, basic discipline was maintained through the Benta routine, brutal physical beatings to the face by superior officers. The Japanese infantryman was accustomed only to extreme violence, both from his enemies and his own commanders. The soft, clinical touch of an American nurse was fundamentally alien to his existence, and it short-circuited his hardened mind. They did not just cry from the physical relief of surviving, or the sudden absence of agonizing pain. They wept from the crushing, suffocating weight of betrayal. As the tears streamed down their faces, soaking into the pristine white pillows, the absolute horror of their situation crystallized. Everything they had been taught was a lie. The Emperor's divine mandate, the inescapable shame of surrender, the terrifying myth of the American monsters. It was all a meticulously fabricated illusion designed to extract their lives for a lost cause. They realized they had fought, starved, and watched their friends die for a phantom. Even worse, they had terrified their own civilians into throwing themselves off cliffs to escape a demonic enemy that simply did not exist. The profound shame they felt was no longer about failing to die in battle. It was a deep, existential shame of having been so thoroughly deceived by their own high command. Furthermore, the presence of the American female nurses drove the final nail into the coffin of their indoctrination. In their darkest, most vulnerable moments, they were not being humiliated by a conquering army. They were being treated, respected, and comforted by women of the very nation they had sworn to annihilate. The psychological friction was unbearable. The weeping was the only release valve for a mind attempting to process the total destruction of its reality. This emotional collapse marked the absolute death of the imperial soldier. The fanatic who had landed on the island, bound by the Senjinkun and fueled by state-mandated hatred, evaporated the moment the American nurse washed the blood from his face. Because his government had already declared him dead, erasing his name. From the Kaseki family registry, he was now a ghost. He belonged to no nation. In his place lay a man completely stripped of his past identity, entirely dependent on the unexpected mercy of his captors, and ready to step into a new complex existence. Behind barbed wire. When the physical wounds of the Japanese soldiers finally closed, and they were transported from the frontline medical tents to permanent prisoner of war facilities, they entered a bizarre and entirely unprecedented chapter of the Pacific conflict. Australia and the continental United States marked the solidification of their psychological metamorphosis. They were no longer soldiers of the Emperor. In the eyes of their government, their communities, and their own rigid cultural framework, they were officially deceased. Funerals had already been held in their hometowns. Small wooden boxes containing lockets of hair or fingernail clippings, mailed back before the battles commenced, rested on family shrines. Because they had ceased to legally and socially exist in Japan, of past ties triggered a behavioral phenomenon that deeply bewildered Allied camp commanders. They fully expected the same suicidal fanaticism that characterized the island battlefields to bleed into the prison blocks. They anticipated a constant violent struggle to maintain order among men who had previously utilized high explosives to avoid capture. Instead, they found themselves managing the most compliant and cooperative prisoners of the entire global war. The catalyst for this radical shift was rooted in the deeply ingrained Japanese societal concept of an infinite burden of debt. By failing to die in combat, the soldier had forfeited his life. Cultural code. The Japanese prisoner did not view his newfound docility as treason against a nation that had already erased him. He viewed it as the absolute necessary repayment of a life debt. To the individuals who had physically resurrected him, this profound concept of rebirth manifested in astonishing ways behind the barbed wire. The POWs rapidly organized themselves, Japanese prisoners voluntarily, formed labor battalions, marching out daily to work in agricultural fields, repair roads, and maintain massive American logistical depots. They approached these mundane tasks with the exact same intense, unyielding discipline they had once applied to combat operations. However, the most powerful displays of this newfound devotion occurred directly within the medical infrastructure. Men who had been pulled from the brink of death by American surgeons actively sought to return to the hospital wards. A hardened Imperial infantryman who only weeks could now be found meticulously scrubbing the floors of an Allied surgical suite, boiling surgical instruments, and respectfully carrying stretchers. They worked seamlessly alongside the very American medical staff who had dismantled their lifelong indoctrination. They eagerly assisted the female nurses they had once been conditioned to fear, offering deep bows of respect in the corridors. In these sanitized wards, the ultimate irony of the Pacific War played out in absolute silence. The fiercest, most uncompromising soldiers of the 20th century had been completely conquered, not by the crushing weight of naval artillery, but by the precise, compassionate application of a sterile bandage, to fully grasp the magnitude of this localized medical compassion, one must zoom out and examine the horrifying statistical reality of the wider Pacific conflict. The pristine climate-controlled wards where Japanese soldiers were carefully nursed back to health stood in jarring, almost incomprehensible contrast to the nightmare unfolding across the rest of the Asian theater. While Japanese prisoners in American custody enjoyed a survival rate that bordered on absolute certainty once they reached established rear echelon facilities, the fate of Allied prisoners in Japanese hands was a systematic descent into industrialized cruelty. The historical numbers alone paint a grim, undeniable picture of two entirely different philosophies of war. Of the tens of thousands of American, British, Australian, and Dutch troops captured by the Imperial Japanese military, nearly a third would never return home. Captured Allied personnel were subjected to the infamous Bataan Death March, locked into the suffocating, lightless holds of unmarked hell ships, and worked to death as slave labor on projects like the Burma Railway. Medical care for these captive men was virtually non-existent. International Red Cross medical parcels were routinely confiscated by camp guards. Allied doctors, themselves starving and suffering from malaria, were forced to perform amputations without anesthetic, using sharpened spoons and scavenged hacksaws. In disease-ridden jungle stockades, this dark reality places an immense. They were not operating in a vacuum, isolated from the brutal truths of the enemy they faced. Through official military intelligence, briefings, news dispatches, and the harrowing, whispered testimonies of escaped Allied prisoners, the staff of these field hospitals knew exactly what the Imperial Japanese Army was doing to their brothers in arms. They knew about the executions. They knew about the deliberate starvation. They knew that captured American nurses in the Philippines had been interned under brutal conditions for years. Yet, when the canvas flaps of the medical tent parted and a shattered, terrified Japanese infantryman was wheeled inside, vengeance. The American medical apparatus maintained an unbreakable wall of professional discipline. An army nurse whose own brother or fiancé might currently be starving on a ration of rotten rice in a bamboo cage in Manchuria still measured out the precise life-saving dose of penicillin for the enemy soldier on her table. A Navy surgeon who had just read reports of Japanese bayonet atrocities still spent 4 exhausting hours under hot surgical lamps, meticulously repairing the shattered femur of a man who had sworn to kill him. This deliberate, institutional choice to separate the total savagery of the battlefield from the sanctity of the medical ward was not merely a triumph of logistics and supply chains. It was a profound psychological victory over the very nature of total war. The Allied medical personnel absolutely refused to let the systemic brutality of their enemy degrade their own fundamental ethical framework. They fought a merciless, mechanized war of annihilation on the blackened volcanic ridges, but in the sterile quiet of the hospital tents, they waged an entirely different kind of campaign. By choosing clinical healing over righteous retribution, they preserved a critical shred of human dignity amidst the deadliest conflict in human history, setting the stage for a final lasting realization that would echo far beyond the end of the war. The peace that eventually settled over the Pacific was not merely drafted on the teak deck of the USS Missouri. It was born quietly and profoundly in the blood-stained canvas tents of Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa. The tears shed by Japanese prisoners of war upon waking in American field hospitals represented far more than the shock of unexpected survival. They marked the absolute collapse of a psychological empire. For decades, the militaristic state had systematically stripped these men of their individuality, weaponizing their very existence through the rigid, unforgiving mandates of the Senjinkun. They were conditioned to die as divine instruments and to view their enemies as mindless, bloodthirsty beasts. Yet, the moment an American nurse calmly adjusted an intravenous drip or administered a dose of penicillin, that terrifying illusion was permanently shattered. The tears of the Japanese infantryman were the painful, overwhelming byproduct of his own returning humanity. He had been promised a gruesome execution at the hands of monsters, but instead, he was given his life back by the quiet, methodical grace of a medical professional. This sterile environment became a silent revolutionary battleground. Here, the United States military proved that even in an era defined by industrialized slaughter, the clinical application of compassion could be devastatingly effective. It dismantled the architecture of fanatical hatred far faster than any naval bombardment. In the end, the technological marvels of the American medical corps, the gleaming hospital ships, the whole blood transfusions, the life-saving antibiotics did more than just mend shattered bones and close gaping wounds. They healed a fractured perception of reality. The female nurses and exhausted surgeons who stood over the operating tables did not just save individual lives. They actively preserved the fundamental dignity of mankind amidst the darkest conflict in human history. They demonstrated that while wars are fought with steel and fire, the minds of men are ultimately conquered by the undeniable, resilient power of empathy.